Imagine you're driving home late at night. You pull into a gas station, maybe grab something to drink, and as you walk back to your car, you notice a minivan parked at the far edge of the lot. The windows are slightly fogged. A child's backpack is pressed against the rear glass. The engine is off. The lights are off. And inside, a family is trying to sleep. You probably don't stop. You probably don't think much of it. And that's exactly the problem. Because that scene isn't rare. It isn't isolated. It isn't the exception to some rule about how life in America is supposed to work. It is quietly, consistently, invisibly happening in parking lots, side streets, and church driveways all across this country every single night. And the people inside those vehicles are not who most of us picture when we hear the word homeless. They're nurses. They're construction workers. They're school teachers' aides and warehouse employees and delivery drivers. They set alarms. They pack lunches. They help their kids with homework in the front seat under the dome light. They are, by nearly every measure, doing what America tells people to do if they want a decent life. And still, the car is the only roof they have. This is not a story about people who gave up. This is a story about a system that stopped holding. There is a powerful image burned into the American consciousness when the word homelessness comes up. It's a person on a city sidewalk, surrounded by belongings in garbage bags, sleeping in a doorway. That image is real. Those people exist and they deserve dignity and solutions just as urgently as anyone else. But that image has also become a kind of blinder, because it stops people from recognizing every other form that housing loss takes. Vehicle homelessness looks nothing like that image. It is designed, almost by necessity, to look like nothing at all. People living in their cars are experts at invisibility. They park in well-lit commercial lots after the businesses close, knowing security tends to be lighter and foot traffic drops to zero. They rotate between spots, never staying long enough in any one place to be noticed. They keep their vehicles clean. They dress carefully in the morning. They time their use of gas station restrooms and public library facilities to avoid drawing attention. They do everything in their power to look, from the outside, like someone who just happened to park there. That invisibility is not accidental. It is survival. Because visibility in this situation brings consequences that arrive fast and hit hard. A knock on the window from a police officer. A parking citation that costs more than a day's food budget. A notice to move along from property that technically prohibits overnight stays. For people already operating with almost no financial margin, each of those encounters is not an inconvenience. It's a crisis. Let's talk about what the data actually shows, and more importantly, what it fails to show. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development conducts what is known as the annual point-in-time count. One night per year, volunteers fan out across the country and attempt to count every person experiencing homelessness. It is the primary dataset policymakers use to understand the scope of the crisis and allocate resources in response. For people sleeping in visible, stationary locations, the count captures a reasonable picture. For people living in vehicles, it fails almost entirely. The method was not built for people who move every few nights, who park in locations specifically chosen to avoid detection, who have spent weeks or months perfecting the art of looking like they belong wherever they are. The result is a systematic undercount so significant that researchers who specialize in this area treat official vehicle homelessness figures as floor estimates, meaning the real number is higher, and likely substantially so. According to research published by the National Alliance to End Homelessness, unsheltered homelessness, which includes vehicle dwelling, represents a growing and increasingly undercounted portion of America's housing crisis. Community advocacy groups and housing researchers consistently report that local figures, when compiled through more rigorous outreach methods, come in dramatically above what the federal count reflects. In Los Angeles County, which has made more sustained efforts to track vehicle homelessness than most jurisdictions, the 2023 homeless count identified over 75,000 people experiencing homelessness, with a significant and growing portion living in cars, vans, and RVs. The Southern California Association of Non-Profit Housing and multiple academic researchers studying the region argue the real figure exceeds official counts considerably, given the structural limitations of counting methodology. The pattern shows up in Seattle, Portland, Phoenix, Denver, Las Vegas, Austin, and increasingly in mid-sized cities that don't make national headlines for their housing crises but are experiencing the same underlying pressures. This is not a coastal elite city problem or a Sun Belt problem. It is an American problem, and it is growing. Here is the detail that tends to stop people when they first encounter it. A substantial share of Americans living in their vehicles are employed. They have jobs. They go to work. They receive paychecks. And when the shift ends, they return to a car. Researchers and social workers who work directly with this population use the term working homeless, and while it sounds like a contradiction, the arithmetic that produces it is depressingly straightforward. If the wages a job pays do not cover the cost of renting an apartment in the city where that job exists, then working that job does not solve the housing problem. It just pays for everything else while the housing problem remains unsolved. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition publishes an annual report called Out of Reach, which calculates what they call the housing wage, the hourly wage a full-time worker needs to earn in order to afford a modest rental home without spending more than 30% of income on housing costs. In their most recent analysis, the national average housing wage for a two-bedroom apartment was over $28 per hour. For a one-bedroom, it exceeded $23 per hour nationally, and in high-demand metro areas, those figures climb significantly higher. The federal minimum wage remains $7.25 per hour. Even in states that have implemented higher minimums, the gap between what entry-level and service sector jobs pay and what housing costs is enormous. A person earning $15 an hour, working full-time, brings home roughly $2,600 per month before taxes. A one-bedroom apartment in most American cities costs $1,400 to $2,000 or more per month. That leaves almost nothing for food, transportation, healthcare, and the unpredictable expenses that life reliably produces. This is not a story about people who didn't try hard enough. This is a story about wages that do not math. One of the most consistent things researchers and social workers report about vehicle homelessness is the speed at which it occurs. There is a popular assumption that housing loss is a slow decline, that there are visible warning signs, that people have time to make adjustments and course correct before reaching the point of sleeping in a vehicle. For the vast majority of vehicle dwellers, that is simply not how it happened. The economic concept that helps explain this is what sociologists call housing precarity, which refers to the condition of holding on to housing not through financial stability, but through the absence of a single destabilizing event. When your rent already consumes 45 or 50% of your income, you are not financially stable. You are stable only if nothing goes wrong, and something always goes wrong. The triggers are well documented. Job loss is the most common. According to research from Princeton University's Eviction Lab, which studies housing instability across American cities, income disruption is the leading immediate cause of eviction and housing loss. Unemployment benefits, where available, typically replace only a fraction of lost wages and are often insufficient to cover rent in high-cost markets. Savings, if they exist at all, tend to carry a household for weeks, not months. And then the math stops working. Medical debt follows a similar path. The United States remains the only wealthy industrialized nation without universal health coverage, and the financial consequences of that gap fall most heavily on households with the least capacity to absorb them. According to research published in the American Journal of Public Health, medical debt is a leading contributor to personal bankruptcy and financial disruption for working and middle-class Americans. A single emergency room visit, a hospitalization, a diagnosis that requires ongoing treatment, any of these can produce bills that dwarf monthly rent and force impossible choices. Divorce and family separation create yet another version of the same problem. One household becoming two means two people simultaneously need independent housing. In markets where even modest apartments are expensive and competitive, that arithmetic often has no clean solution. What strikes researchers most is not that these events happen, but how quickly a household that appeared stable from the outside can find itself without housing. Not over years. Sometimes over weeks. Getting into a vehicle is fast. Getting out is not. This is one of the cruelest dynamics of vehicle homelessness, and it is one that is rarely discussed in public conversations about housing policy. The assumption is that vehicle dwelling is temporary, a stopgap between one housing situation and the next. For many people, it starts that way. But the conditions that make it difficult to rent housing in the first place become significantly more difficult to overcome once you're living in a car. Renting an apartment requires a security deposit, typically equal to 1 or 2 months' rent. It requires proof of income, usually a pay stub showing earnings at a multiple of the monthly rent. It requires landlord references from previous rental history. It often requires a credit check that reflects a financial history. When someone loses housing abruptly due to eviction, job loss, or medical crisis, all of those requirements become simultaneously harder to meet. Eviction records appear on background checks and disqualify applicants from large swaths of the rental market. Credit scores drop when bills go unpaid during a crisis. Savings that would have served as a security deposit get consumed by survival needs. Economists describe this dynamic as the poverty penalty, the phenomenon by which financial instability doesn't simply reflect a lack of resources, but actively generates additional costs and barriers that make rebuilding harder. Parking citations accumulate when safe, legal overnight spots are scarce. Impound fees compound when citations go unpaid. Vehicle repair costs, which for someone living in their car are simultaneously a housing expense and a transportation expense, arrive without warning and without any good time to pay them. Without a stable mailing address, access to government assistance programs becomes complicated. Benefits applications require documentation. Documentation requires addresses. Addresses require stability. The circular logic of bureaucratic systems designed for people with stable lives creates genuine obstacles for people trying to exit instability. Every conversation about vehicle homelessness eventually has to reckon with what it means for the children living it. The National Center for Homeless Education, which tracks student homelessness as required under the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, reports that over 1 million students in the United States experience homelessness in a given school year. The federal definition used for this count includes students living in cars, motels, shelters, and other temporary arrangements. A meaningful portion of those 1 million children sleep in vehicles every night. Think about what that means for a 12-year-old getting ready for school. The morning begins in the back seat. Getting dressed requires strategy and privacy management. Breakfast might be a gas station snack or something from a food bank bag. The social management of keeping this invisible from peers and teachers is a full-time psychological effort layered on top of everything else a middle schooler is already navigating. Research on childhood housing instability consistently documents measurable harm that extends well beyond the period of instability itself. A landmark study published in Pediatrics found that children who experienced housing instability in early childhood showed significantly lower cognitive scores and behavioral outcomes compared to stably housed peers, with effects that persisted even after housing was secured. The National Bureau of Economic Research has published multiple papers documenting that housing instability during childhood is associated with lower educational attainment, reduced lifetime earnings, and worse health outcomes. These are not temporary inconveniences. They are development-altering experiences happening to children who have no agency over their circumstances and no awareness of the broader structural forces that put them in that back seat. They are simply children, trying to get through a Tuesday, carrying an invisible weight most of their teachers don't know is there.